This is part 1 of a complete series showing how to disassemble, inspect, modify for extreme off-road use, and reassemble a Suzuki Samurai solid front axle. In today's presentation, we'll be showing the disassembly procedures. Begin by supporting the front axle assembly on jack stands and drain the oil by removing the drain plug using a 19mm socket. After the oil is drained, reinstall the drain plug. Remove the brake rotor by striking it sharply with a dead blow hammer. Remove the locking hub dial bolts using a 10mm socket. Once the bolts are removed, remove the locking hub dial and gasket and set it aside. Remove the axle snap ring using snap ring spreader pliers. Remove the locking hub bolts using a 12mm socket. Then remove the locking hub and locking hub gasket. In order to remove the wheel bearing lock nut, this tab needs to be bent open. Strike the tab using a cold chisel and hammer. Once the tab is straight, remove the bearing lock nut using a 2-inch spindle nut socket. Using a screwdriver, remove the lock washer. Once the lock washer has been removed, remove the bearing adjustment nut using a 2-inch socket. Remove the thrust washer. Loosen the outer wheel bearing by pulling outward on the hub and then remove the bearing. Then remove the hub, which also contains the inner wheel bearing and grease seal. Place the hub on the workbench supported by 2 2x4s with the studs oriented upward. Using a round nose punch and hammer, drive out the inner wheel bearing and seal. Flip the hub over with the wheel studs oriented downward and using the same punch and hammer, drive out the outer bearing race. This is done by striking the race sharply, alternating side to side. Now turn the hub back over and using the same approach drive out the inner bearing race. The race will hit the workbench before it comes completely out, so you'll need to support it with the 2 blocks of wood to completely remove the inner bearing race. Using a 14mm socket, remove all 4 of the backing plate and spindle bolts. Once the bolts are removed, remove the backing plate and spindle assembly. Then separate the backing plate and the spindle. Disconnect the tie rod from the steering arm. This is done by straightening the cotter pin, tapping it with a hammer, and pulling it out with pliers. Once the cotter pin has been removed, remove the tie rod nut using a 17mm socket. Disconnect the tie rod stud from the steering arm by striking it sharply with a hammer. If you plan on reusing the tie rod end, you'll want to disconnect it using a tie rod fork or a ball joint press. Rotate the axle 90 degrees. Remove the upper kingpin bolts using a 12mm socket. Loosen the kingpin by tapping it with a brass hammer. Once loose, pry it out with a pry bar. Be careful not to damage the steering knuckle or kingpin mating surfaces. Be sure to note the number and location of the shims associated with each kingpin so they can be reinstalled in the same location. This will make reassembly and kingpin bearing adjustment easier upon reassembly. Remove the lower kingpin in the same way as the upper. Using a 12mm socket, remove all 8 of the knuckle ball seal bolts. Remove the knuckle ball seal retainer halves. Set the knuckle ball pad and seal back out of the way. then remove the steering knuckle. Once the knuckle has been removed, remove the upper kingpin bearing and the lower kingpin bearing. Remove the axle and berfield joint and set it aside. Remove the knuckleball pad and seal. Using a cloth, wipe out any excess grease and clean up the knuckleball area. Using a seal puller, remove the axle seal. Do the final cleaning of the knuckleball with brake clean and a cloth. Next, remove the kingpin bearing races. This is done by driving them out from the inside using a round punch and a hammer. Strike the race sharply, alternating sides, until it comes out. Remove the top race and then the bottom. Disassemble the passenger side hub and steering knuckle assembly by following the same steps as shown on the driver's side. Next, remove the differential assembly. This is done by removing the 8 bolts using a 12mm socket. Once all 8 bolts are removed, strike the differential using a dead blow hammer until it becomes loose. Then carefully pry the differential from the housing in several locations. Be sure not to damage the mating surfaces between the differential assembly and the axle housing. Once the differential is loose, lift it out and set it aside. That concludes today's presentation. Join us for part 2, where we'll show how to modify and reinforce the front axle housing and get it ready for reassembly. If ever we can help you with any of your off-road needs, simply log on to www.lowrangeoffroad.com or give us a call at 801-805-6644.